Hey everybody, welcome to Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'm Tim Derling, and I've been doing a lot of interviews lately as a writer, but now I'm actually going to be interviewing a writer for a nice change. Author Brian Heaton, who is the author of this, if it looks like I'm struggling with something, this mighty volume I hold in my hands here, Roads to Madness, the touring history of Queensrÿche, 1981 to 1987. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Um, I mean, I'm just going to guess that a book like this doesn't happen unless you have a passionate fan doing it. So I'm just going to guess this is Queensryche's a favorite of yours.
Yeah, just a little bit, for
Yeah,
sure.
just
35, 40 years of fandom and collecting, you kind of build it up and have something to say after all that time.
so this book is as in depth. I'll be honest with you, I wish every band had a book on them like this on their touring history. I know there's a Kiss one, but this is so in depth. This talks about the very beginnings of the various members of Queensrÿche all the way up to 97, the Here and the Now Frontier tour. And this has everything that a fan could want who wants to know about this touring history, which is a really fascinating look into how a rock band rises and how they gradually, you can see they're playing bigger and bigger venues. They're not opening. Now they're a special guest. Now they're a headliner. And very few bands get to a high point and stay there. There's the inevitable, decline, and you can see that happening too. Um, it's a it's a fascinating read, and it's got so much cool memorabilia in here. Um, and one thing that you and I have in common is that this book and my newest book, Let It Be Your Guide to Kansas album review, both have a forward by our buddy Jeff Wagner. How'd that come
Yep.
about?
Well, Jeff and I struck up a friendship when he did the biography on Fate's Warning, and
Great,
we talked a
great book,
lot back and forth. Yeah, so that's a great book, and
fantastic
congratulations
book.
on your book about Kansas as well. I'm going on vacation soon, and it's actually on the list to pick up to read over vacation. So
Well,
thanks for
thank you
doing
very
that
much.
as a fan, one fan to the other. Um,
Awesome.
but yeah, we struck up a friendship years ago, and after all that time, I was like, this is the perfect guy. He gets Queensryche. He loved old school Queensryche, and I just felt with the connection with Fate's Warning and a lot of the prog that he loves as well, he'd be the perfect person to kind of, set the tone for the book. So yeah,
Yeah, it was
that
great.
came
It
about.
was great having him do the forward for me too. He's got a way with words, and he's such a literate guy, and he's so passionate about the music, knows it inside out. And so we also should give credit to Brian Nairn because
Yes.
he's co-credited on here. What was Brian's the Brian and Brian, like what did each of you do as far as putting this book together?
Brian Nairn is probably one of the five top Queensryche collectors of their memorabilia and their historical artifacts in the world. He's got a gigantic traveling museum called the Reichian Archives, which he puts on in hotel room ballrooms during big Queensryche events and weekends and different things like that up in Seattle. And he and I have been friends for 25 years at this point, and we worked on the Queensryche biography together, which is called Building an Empire, the Story of Queensryche. The two of us wrote some, particularly me, on that book. The main author of that is James Beach. But Brian is he's got this perfect way of marrying. He's a visual guy. And I knew when I wanted to write this that I wanted to do it in a way that would appeal to the collector. And the perfect person for that was Brian Nairn, because not only all of his collectibles, but he knows the history behind the imagery, has a way of saying, hey, that image really would look better paired with this. And he was just the perfect guy to do this with me. Lifelong friend and really creative guy.
So here's a typical page full of Queensrÿche ticket stubs. I love looking at ticket stubs. One thing I'm fascinated by is looking at the prices and what they used to be compared to what they are now. There's some backstage passes. Yeah, it sounds very similar to sort of the relationship I have with my good friend Matt Phillips. He's been instrumental in helping me with all of my books. And he's a graphic designer and he thinks visually and he notices things I never would about does that really make sense next to this? Should that mean over here? And yeah, you have to have that creative back and forth. But yeah, there's so much awesome memorabilia. There's some great fan photos of the band from different uh, concerts over the years, in stores, a lot of in stores. And I think one of the fascinating things for me is the changes in Jeff Tate's stage raps over the years. That's one thing I picked up on that. I mean, Jeff's a very erudite, well-spoken guy, and it's just been interesting because I'm noticing that he'll have his, sort of spiel worked out, and he'll basically use the same one all through a tour with maybe some slight variations depending on the crowd. But it's funny how there's so many of those printed out and how those changed over the years. So I guess a question: when did you get into Queensrÿche, and what was it that did it for you?
For me, it was Rage for Order, probably late 1987, maybe the early part of 1988. A friend of mine came home with Rage for Order and says, "You got to listen to this." He dubbed me a copy of the cassette, as we did back in those days, and I threw it in my Walkman on the way home, and boom, Walk in the Shadows hit me, and I'm like, "Who the hell is this guy singing? I mean, what
Yeah,
amazing voice!" And it didn't. Rage for Order kind of started me on the path, but then a few months down the line, when Operation Mindcrime came out, that sold me. Like it was like,
yeah,
okay, that took this band from being one that I'm following and that I like to, oh my, this is something that this is for me. And it just exploded from there, and I became a huge fan and collector, and traveled to see them, tons of times. I'm probably up around 40 at this point, seeing Queensryche, and it was, a love affair with their live performance. I tried to get every bit of information I could before I started actually going to their shows, just learning about what they were playing. And every time you would see a magazine clipping, especially, during the Mindcrime era, I would clip that. I'd go to the store, buy the magazine, see it. Oh, they're reviewing the show. And I'd clip that out and I'd save all that stuff. So that's how it kind of got started, and the passion for seeing them live and all the nuances with their live performance.
yeah. So how do you even start chronicling the 16-year chunk of a band's career? Like you must have just how long did this take? I guess that's another question.
That's actually a two-part answer. Um, I had a website for many, many years, since probably the mid 90s, and it changed names. It was Breaking the Silence, then it was the Breakdown Room, then it was anybodylistening.net. And I had that website from probably
I
1995.
remember anybody listening.net.
You remember that one?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that website was together from 95 to 2016. And what I did was I collected the set lists from people who went to shows. I collected all those ticket stubs, um, photos. I just kind of put them online and did all that. And that's kind of how the genesis of the book came about, because I had this website where I was really strict about what I would include as a set list. It would have to be kind of double checked with a bootleg, something that could verify things. I didn't want to use setlist.fm for this book, and I never did at all. I looked at it, but it was more like I'm not relying on the information.
It's
I
only
have the
good. It's only
information.
as good as it's like Wikipedia. It's like Discogs. It's only as
Yeah.
good as the contributors.
Crowdsourcing is wonderful, but there's a lot of errors in setlist.fm from the shows in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And so it was really important to me to make sure I independently verified that stuff. But it was, I kept track of all that information over 20 some odd years, 25 years. And it was just at a point where I wanted to redo the website and do it in a different way. And I just don't have the HTML skills to do something like that anymore, and the web design skills. That's passed me by. And being an author, it was like, well, Rush has one of my favorite touring history books. Kiss has these things out. I'm going to do one for Queensryche. And so I sat down from I think it was 2021 when we finished the biography on the band, and that's where kind of the seeds of it started. And I really got moving as we got into 2022. So it took about 2.5 years to kind of compile my old information, verify it all, um, and then add things like you mentioned, Tate's stage banter and all that. That was a late add, actually. That was actually an interesting story because what I really wanted to do, Tim, was put in the information regarding capacities for venues and the amount of people that were in there. And it became really tough to get that information for the shows in the 80s. I could do it for the
Mhm.
90s, but
Yeah.
it was hard in the 80s, and I didn't want to have something incomplete. So I took that out and just said, hey, I've accumulated 300, 350, could even be 400 at this point, shows of the original lineup of Queensryche. Why don't I just sit down and transcribe what Tate's been saying? And because I didn't see any other tour book that ever did that. And I said this would be a nice way for people to kind of relive the show and make it more an interactive book that you have to keep going back to. And that's when it really started for me.
Yeah, it's yeah, the amount of I can only imagine the amount of listening that you would have to do to yeah, and you're right. I forgot about the Rush one, Walking the Face of the Earth. I forgot about that one. That's one of many books I need to get. But yeah, this thing, I mean, this is physically heavy. I mean, this is a substantial book, and it will keep you riveted. Like if you're any level of Queensryche fan at all, especially if you were at any of these shows. Now, I wasn't, but I'm looking at these, and it's just interesting seeing, how they progressed from, opening for Dio and Twisted Sister and all these bands, and uh, Bon Jovi, and then
Yeah.
Metallica, Def Leppard, and then they're headlining, and it was such an interesting, because I remember, I got into Queensryche. Uh, I didn't really get into them until, oddly enough, '93, because a friend of mine showed me the Operation Live Crime VHS, and I couldn't believe how tight they were, and I couldn't believe how theatrical it was and how note perfect everything sounded. And so I got into them sort of retroactively then. But I remember my first memory of Queensryche, because I grew up in Canada. I remember watching Much Music. I watched Much Music all the time, sort of Canada's equivalent to MTV. And they would play in fall of '86. They played the Gonna Get Close to You video a lot. And years later, I'm like, well, now I know why they played it so much, because being in radio, it's Canadian content because it's
Hmm.
Del Bello.
Yep.
And yeah, and then Empire got really, really big. And would you say that, in terms of the band's career, that was a double-edged sword, the success of Empire and how long that tour was?
I don't think it was a double-edged sword in terms of where they were progressing as a band because you mentioned something earlier about how you could see them progress from being openers to being direct support to being headliners. I think that was a blessing for them, even though I know they were frustrated that they weren't getting that initial success as quickly as they wanted. But it was a blessing because once they got to Empire, they knew what to do. Building Empire's tour, I mean, they knew immediately what they had to do in order to deliver those shows live. And the backing tracks on there were some, but they were really minimal. Most
Yes.
of all of those vocals were all done live from Eddie Jackson and Chris DeGarmo, obviously, with doing the backing vocals. But I think the tour went on probably a little longer than it should have.
I guess that's what I'm
Um,
getting at on a personal level. They were
yeah,
never quite the same after that.
no, they weren't. I mean, for me, going through this whole book and kind of going through things, I think taking that, they started the tour in late October of 1990, and they wrapped it up in January of 1992.
That's
And
all.
I think had they not gone to Europe to do Monsters of Rock in summer of 1991 and just kind of did their Northwest leg of their tour and did all that and wrapped it up probably September, October of 91, I think they might have all had that breather that they desperately needed because obviously it took them another 4 years to play live again after that tour was over.
Yeah, it not only did, yeah, it's not just the gap between the albums, it's the gap between the last show of the Empire Tour and then the beginning of the Promised Land Tour. I was particularly interested to read about the Here and the Now Frontier era, which is like the end of the book. But I personally really liked that album. I know a lot of fans don't like it, but I liked it from the first time it came out. I mean, it's very dry. It's very stripped back, but I think the songs are fantastic. But it wasn't a success, and they're playing, you know, smaller venues and maybe not so well attended, but obviously that was DeGarmo's end of being a full-on member of the group. Were there any parts in doing the research as a longtime fan? What's the most strange or interesting thing you learned as a fan in putting this together? Was there anything that just, wow, I didn't know that? Or
There were a couple things. The impact that their first managers had on their initial success. Kim and Diana Harris, who owned Easy Street Records in Seattle, they they were married at the time, and they offered to be the band's managers, and they had lots of connections in the industry that enabled the band to really get paid a lot better than almost every opening act in the United States. So having all those connections enable Queensryche to really not be in debt to a label for tour support money. And I think that's a big thing a lot of people that aren't really familiar with the music industry, the history of the music industry, might not know, is that back in the 80s and 90s, you got all that money that to go out on tour, the label provided that, and the bands would have to pay that back. Nowadays, it's different. The label doesn't give a band any money. The band has to basically self-finance what they're doing, and
yeah,
and that was a really foreign concept for bands. For Queensryche back in 1997 on the Here and Now Frontier tour, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the impact of their first managers, Kim and Diana Harris, can't be understated enough. I mean, can't be overstated enough. They were absolutely instrumental in getting Queensryche not only their record deal, but getting out there in front of people time and time again. Queensryche just grew to a size where they couldn't handle them anymore. They were just a mom and pop record shop in Seattle, and after 5 years, they needed to move on. But
yeah,
they were instrumental. Um, Another thing was some of the early vocal lessons that Jeff Tate kind of had in terms of learning how to sing on the road. In the book, which Tim, I know you read this, but I interviewed the band's first crew member, David Morris, and I didn't really know how much Jeff actually needed to learn how to handle life on the road as a singer. He was so phenomenal from the get-go. And I was shocked at some of the things that they had to do in order to make sure Jeff kept singing at a high level throughout that EP tour until he got his feet wet and understood what it took to sing at that kind of a level 5 days a week, 6 days a week. And that was really eye-opening for me. And I'm glad that I was able to kind of acquire that information and interview some people that could shed some light on that.
well, yeah, because I mean, I think the singers get the hardest job of anybody because if the guitar player breaks the strings, he can change strings, he can change guitars. Drummer breaks a stick, busts a snare, they can replace that. Your voice is your instrument, and if it goes, it goes. And you're there in a crowd of people, and it's a must be really tough psychologically on a singer when that happens, because it's nothing you can do about it. And to learn how to, yeah, I mean, he had that raw talent, but to harness that voice and not over sing and blow his voice out, that must have taken some discipline. These are also young guys on the road, right? They're going to do what
Exactly.
young rock bands do. So, yeah. And I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but one of the more compelling parts of the book was something that happened in Europe at a gig where the security was not up to par, and
Mhm.
I'll leave that. And the stories about that were, I didn't know about that. I didn't remember reading about that because I bought all the magazines, the Circus and Hit Parader, Metal Edge back in the day. I never read anything about that. I had no idea, and that was like, wow, That would do a number on you psychologically too.
It must have, and I won't spoil it either, but just to say there's a live recording of that show that I have and that I transcribed the stage banter for leading up to some stuff. And, the band stopped playing abruptly. And I had a friend who was in the audience of that show where they had light security, and he wrote a beautiful essay, really nice first person account of what went on at that particular gig. That many people don't know about that. And it was, you know, it it was shocking for the band. So I know I'm leading people in here, and I probably should mention what it is. But if you pick up a copy of the book, it's something on the Empire Tour, and it's a story you'll be interested in.
Well, we'll say this. I mean, when you think about, I mean, we've all been to shows at somewhere where you wonder whether it's a small club or whether it's a big show. Sometimes you get some rowdy people. You wonder if it's going to get out of control.
Yep.
And you have that mob mentality take over because it happens. Same thing happened to AC/DC on the Razor's Edge tour, and I think in Salt Lake City.
Mm-hmm.
Happened to The Who in Cincinnati in '79. Need I mention the Great White Club
Exactly.
debacle in 2003? So, yeah, I think anybody that's ever been to a show, you can't help but think about that. Nobody goes to a show.
Unfortunately, it's a part of life now,
Yeah.
and sad that it is, but it has been for quite some time. And always good to just keep your eyes around you when you go into a big public place and security is light.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess another obvious question. I mean, I'm telling you right now, folks, if you're a Queensrÿche fan and you're thinking you want this book, you want this book. It's just it's a great read. It's a fascinating read. It would almost be interesting on any band, but if it's a band that you're into, it's even better. But I am curious, and I think I probably know the answer to it, and it's a multi-layered question. But my first part of the question would be, why stop? Why did you stop in '97? Did you just want to chronicle the original five, and that was it?
Well, it's multiple answers, to be honest with you, Tim.
Yeah.
It was, I really believe, and that most people who are interested in Queensrÿche, that interest started with the original five. The original five guys, that was the pinnacle of their career with Mindcrime and Empire. And I think everybody who starts with Queensrÿche starts with that original band. So I felt that was a nice box, right? I could chronicle that original band's touring history, and it would be pretty organized to do it in that fashion. The other one was, this book originally was supposed to be 400 pages. And for people who don't have the book and haven't seen it or just seen the cover, it's not a standard like biography size, like a 6x9. It's oversized. It's a coffee table book. It's 8.5 by 11. And so the idea was it was going to be 400 pages. Yeah. And by the time I got done with the whole thing, it was close to 600 pages. And while I would have been interested in going on and doing the other eras of Queensrÿche, there's no way that I thought it would make sense to do a 1,000-page book or an 800-page book at this point. Because the other thing that I think many fans might be surprised, Queensrÿche actually toured more after DeGarmo left than they did while he was in the band. Those
That
years,
makes sense.
Go ahead, Tim.
I was going to say that makes sense because when the records stopped selling, not just their records, but everybody's, the money was in touring.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially, the early and mid 2000s, Queensrÿche was doing 120 dates a year, 130 dates a year. That was, they did that on Empire. They did like 189, 191, something like that on Empire. But for most of their other tours, it was, 120, 130 gigs. Well, they were doing that every year after Chris left. So it was a big deal. And so any sort of book that would come after, to do more in this first volume of this would have been just too big of an undertaking. Doesn't mean there might not be a part two down the road.
I'm going to ask that too, because as we all know,
the information's there for it, and I've thought about it, but I've got a couple other mountains I want to climb first, and then take a look at how this book is done, and maybe then consider it going down the line. But yeah, if I would have done it all in one shot, people would have been like, "Oh, this is great, 1981 through 2012," but the book's 1,200 pages. I mean, what are you going to do with something like that? I mean, the price point of that would have been outrageous.
Yeah, that makes
So,
sense. That's
yeah,
I totally understand that. That's why my last two books aren't color inside
right.
of them. Whether,
Yeah,
you know, it's price point. You don't make enough, and you'd have to sell so much that you wouldn't sell as many. So you'd rather get them out to as many people as possible. But obviously, that would be a fascinating endeavor. Like, you know, if you were going to pick it up at 97 and just keep on going, I'm curious, very curious, how would you approach the split?
I would probably, you're talking about the split of Jeff when Jeff
Yeah,
leaves?
2013, when there, you know, that brief period where there were two entities out there releasing
Mhm.
albums and touring as Queensrÿche.
If I do a second volume of this, it would be 1999 because that's when their first shows after Chris. 1999 through 2012. It would be from the point where they fired Jeff.
Okay.
Um, and I would stop it there because that would give you a nice, it would be a nice package like that. And then I would have to maybe I would put like that whole 2013 era that would be a separate thing. And then if I were to do a third volume from, let's say, like 2013 to the present time, whatever that may be, the Jeff Tate's Queensryche dates that went out and all that, that would probably be more of an appendix thing.
Okay.
Just because the name Queensryche eventually was awarded to Jackson and Wilton and Rockenfield. So
Yeah.
to make things work, that's probably how I would do it.
Yeah. That makes sense because it was pretty messy there for a while. It was really messy there for a while.
Yeah,
Um,
certainly was.
but yeah, you know, I've never had the chance. I've never had the chance to see Queensrÿche. The closest I've come is earlier this year. I did get to see Jeff
Mhm.
uh, in Portland, Maine, and he has a great band. Um, and he sounded fantastic.
I watched your video review recap of that adventure you had going to see him, yeah, it was. I love the enthusiasm. I forget your friend's name who you went along with that, but the
It was
enthusiasm
Matt and
was
Chris
really cool.
went with me. Chris wasn't on camera, but yeah, my buddy Matt. But that's what I'm talking about. That helps me design the books. That's the guy.
Oh, okay, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And I just couldn't believe how good he sounded because, you know, as fans, we all saw some pretty poor clips in the early 2010s that just wasn't making it right. But yeah, he sounded fantastic. I mean, they even did Queen of the Reich, and you know, no, he didn't hold the note for as long, but he got there.
right.
And
Yeah.
yeah, so it was pretty fascinating. But that's been a whole fascinating period because you know, I'm a really big fan of all the Todd La Torre albums, and I really liked, in particular, I really liked the first Operation Mindcrime band album.
Hmm.
Uh, I really liked that one. I thought that the second and third were diminishing returns, but um, yeah, I remember in 2013 how novel it was that there were two new albums out by two different groups of musicians, both under the name Queensrÿche. To the point, I think you'll appreciate this lunacy, where I made a mix CD up of both of them, where I alternated between the albums, and I discovered something really weird when I did that. How some of the song titles linked up.
Huh,
For
really?
example, A World Without, Life Without You. Like there were different things that almost sounded like a running order, like it was meant to sound, but going between, you know, the Frequency Unknown and the self-titled album.
Oh, that's
But
interesting. Yeah, I would have never
yeah,
thought to do that.
yeah, I wouldn't recommend it. It's not for the faint of heart. It's pretty musical whiplash, but yeah, guys, this is this is not a pickup. I'm just going to pick this up and kind of glance. No, you want to read this from cover to cover, but it's a gorgeous book in terms of layout. There's some great photos. There's some great stories. There's some great stories from fans meeting the band at in stores, and their impressions of, you know, what the band sounded like. I mean, this is a band that I think people forget. This is a band that sold, I think, Empire's triple platinum
Hmm.
at this.
It is
Promised Land is platinum. Mind Crime well, it's platinum anyway, maybe double platinum by now.
by now.
Uh,
Yeah.
but yeah, the EP and The Warning and Rage for all went gold. They sold a lot of records, and I think people forget that. And um, it's a quite a in some ways it was an unlikely success story in the 80s. Prog to bring that prog metal sound, whatever you want to call it, back. And I love the fact that they broke with a concept album. Like there's something really cool about that nobody was expecting. It was like a sleeper hit. And yeah. And also it's don't you think it's so interesting that was the timing was so perfect that they had Mind Crime, which had a lot of buzz. It was their first gold record. Then they put out Empire. Silent City is a top 10 pop single. That enables them to tour bigger and longer. It was the perfect opportunity for them to do Operation Mind Crime.
It was.
So they were supporting two, like really that whole tour, they're supporting two albums in a way.
In a way, yeah. I mean, obviously they toured for a year or so in support of Operation Mindcrime with Metallica and Def Leppard, and did some of their own headline shows. But one of the nice things that happened at that point too was that video for Eyes of a Stranger really kicked things into high gear for them in January of '89, and
Yeah.
that enabled them to all of a sudden, boom, the record started selling like crazy. And then they had to get off the tour with Metallica, and then they found themselves, hey, we can go headline for 2 weeks in Japan and come home and play amphitheaters as the headliner. Home, and they played the West Coast of the United States in '89. Again, it's that progression that they got from just a slow build, and they had a lot of things happen that the timing was just it's kind of magical the way some of it happened. In retrospect, you look back and you're like, oh, it's a beautiful growth. And they were really frustrated at the time about trying to get to a gold record, to get to the platinum level, to do more. And it just was a natural progression, and they got better and better and more capable of handling it. Funny story, you mentioned Silent Lucidity. Silent Lucidity was never even supposed to be on Empire. It was something that Chris kind of came up with, and it got heard, and it was like, oh, this has to go on the record, but it was never going to be on there. Imagine if it never did.
How many times have you heard that about a band's breakthrough song
Yeah,
wasn't even supposed to be on the album? Almost every time you hear that.
always. And you can never predict that kind of thing, you know. And
Yeah.
Queensrÿche's had other songs that have that kind of element, and they never had the same success. I mean, you think about the Killing Words from Rage for Order, or No Sanctuary from The Warning. None of that stuff really did anything. It was, I mean, they're great songs, and I think the fans love them.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, it never triggered this as a single. For some reason, Lucidity was the right thing at the right time, and it really enabled them to boom and become household names. And again, that was great for them at the time, and it also led to, I would say it also led to them being pigeonholed a little bit as a '80s act. And when music industry started changing and interest started changing, Queensrÿche kind of, they were still playing amphitheaters in '95, when a
They had
lot of the kids
they
kind of
had a
went by the
platinum
wayside.
album. Yeah, they
Yeah.
had a platinum album, and they're still doing well, and with a pretty elaborate stage too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Promised Land set up in 1995. They played some shows in '94, but the tour really started in '95 with their full staging. That was even more grand than the Building Empires tour. I mean, for
Yeah.
people who weren't there, in the book, I came up with I had like a page that has a whole bunch of still shots of some of the animation that they used to play on the screens above the stage, and there's some live photos by a couple professional photographers and then a couple of amateur photographers that just kind of gives the idea of the breadth of that tour. And that was mesmerizing. As I remember being, 19 and sitting in the audience and watching that show, it was, I mean, it blew me away. It was Pink Floyd with teeth. It
Yeah.
was really an amazing visual and audio experience, and yeah, so they were still at the top of their game back then, and it was just a testament to their abilities as a band that they kind of persevered through all of the changing tides of the musical landscape. A lot of people don't know this too, Tim. Like you think about it, like nowadays people say Seattle, oh, music. You have the whole grunge era and you have all this stuff. Well, when Queensryche broke, there really wasn't much of music in Seattle in terms of big time players. You had Jimi Hendrix and
Yeah.
you had Hart.
Hard. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
was really it. Yeah, Pat Travers had some success, and there was another band, TKO, that got signed. But to be honest with you, Seattle was nowhere land. And,
Yeah.
again, their management and Queensrÿche having the right stuff at the right time really enabled them to get out on the road. And they really set the stage. It doesn't get talked about enough, but Queensrÿche really set the stage for bands like Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains and Soundgarden to have that success in the 90s because it was always like, hey, Queensryche is from Seattle. What else is going on?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's
It's
what happened.
true. Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't get their due. Um, so where is the easiest place for folks to pick up this book, Roads to Madness?
The easiest place is to go to roadstomadness.com. If you go on there, there's a link that as soon as you select the version of the book that you're interested in, it takes you to the publisher's website. The book is published by Northwest Metalworks, and their website name it's their company name is spelled a little funny. So roadstomadness.com will get you where you need to go, and you can take a look at all the different versions of the book. A point that I wanted to mention too is you mentioned that when we were talking about designing books and doing the right size books, Roads to Madness, no matter what version you get, is full color. That was one of the things that Brian Nairn and I both agreed from a visual standpoint this needed to be. And so it's a huge book, but it's completely in color. Every photograph that was in color is in color. There's a couple sets that are black and white, and we did that on purpose. Again, different types of photos from different types of photographers to really give fans and give people a nice visual overview of what the band looked like throughout the many different eras.
Yeah, they certainly did change visually too. I will have the link to that posted. So I've just got one more question for you, Brian. As a fan, what's up with Scott Rockenfield?
um, well, I mean,
Does
the easy
anybody
answer is
know?
you probably need to ask Scott, but I will say this. I don't really know what he's doing professionally, but I did see a photograph of him and a friend of mine from 2 weeks ago. And Scott looks happy. He looks healthy. Um, I I don't know what he's doing musically. You can check out his website. I know he's got one up there. I haven't looked at it in a while. I believe he's still doing film scoring and doing a lot of stuff. And he looks great. So I don't really know what's up. Like a lot of fans, you see all these break aparts of bands, and it kind of, it's like, oh, Queensryche, you still got Eddie Jackson and Michael Wilton and Jeff Tate, you still got the voice. In some ways, it's one of the greatest times to be a Queensryche fan because you can go see the band who's called Queensryche as Queensryche, and they're playing the old songs very well on their Origins tour and everything. And if that doesn't work for you as a fan because maybe it's not the full band, well, then you can go see Jeff. And Jeff puts together a good show, typically in a little bit of a smaller venue, and
Yeah.
still plays for 2 hours and sings well with the voice that you remember. So I just feel like people who are fans of Queensryche, I think most of us would love to see the original five members get back together. Whether or not that happens, I don't know. I think we've all been asking that question for 27 years, and it still hasn't happened. So I don't really think that's ever going to be in the cards. So go out and enjoy Queensryche's music. Whether it's Jeff, whether or not it's the band, just go enjoy the music and enjoy the tunes.
Absolutely. And another thing is like, Jeff coming to Portland, Maine, that was coming to a place where, it was a 6-hour drive. It was doable.
Yeah.
Whereas, the Queensryche band, they were here in 2015, not far, about 3 hours away from me, opening for Scorpions. But number one, I'm not much of a Scorpions fan. And number two, if I want to see Queensryche, I'd want to see a headline show.
Right.
So who knows? I mean, Eastern Canada is not a great place if you like classic rock bands. I will say that. I love it here, but it's not. It is not a regular stop. But yeah, you're right. No, you're absolutely right. And you know, going back to those two albums that came out in 2013, I really liked both of them. In spite of everything and all the bad press that was coming out at the time, I pre-ordered Frequency Unknown. I eventually got the remixed version, and I got it. And I'm like, you know what? I like most of the songs on here. It's not Queensryche per se, but it's good songs. You know, it's a good collection of songs. And then when the self-titled came out, I was way into that. So, you know, we get two albums. I mean, you know, there's a personal cost, right? You know, but we have nothing to do with that as fans. We just enjoy the music, and hopefully, and I know that you know, I remember reading where Jeff and Todd actually, they were at the same place.
Yeah.
So it seemed like there was an olive branch there. I'm like, that's great. That's great. You know, life's too short to carry the grudges around. So,
Well, I
but
know
anyway,
Jeff Tate. Yeah, I know Jeff Tate has said recently in interviews that, you know, time has healed a lot of the angst and anger and everything from his end about all that stuff, and that, you know, for business purposes they have to communicate with one another via email, and it's been better, and I'm paraphrasing here, but you know, it's nice to hear that. Again, I mean, as a fan, and you know, trying to be in a romantic about it, I would love for them to just figure it out, you know. But Queensryche's a very complex animal, with a lot of different personalities, and it just is what it is. And yeah, I mean, my thing to any of the fellow fans out there of the band, it's enjoy the band any way you can, you know. And
yeah,
if it ends up you don't want to go see either version, well, you got a bunch of nice records from the past and a bunch of live recordings. Go enjoy those, you know, and just keep the spirit of this band alive, because it's a great one. And I think that as more time goes on, I think people are going to appreciate their entire catalog a lot more.
yeah. And one more thing, are you a little surprised that the current Queensryche hasn't put out any kind of live album or Blu-ray concert? Because most bands do at this point.
I'm not surprised, and I can tell you why. I know you don't, I don't think you know this, Tim, but I knew those guys in Queensryche pretty well over the years. Especially during the time where they had just split off from Jeff Tate. And so I was in the room when they had a conversation about doing a live record. And one of the things was that a lot of people video everything and put it up on YouTube. So how are you going to get your bang for the buck if you rent all of these cameras and have a really professional recording done? Is it really going to move the needle? And I can understand that. That said, as a fan, I really am waiting. Like, it would really be nice to have the big production and have them put out a huge thing, two CDs, two DVDs or Blu-rays, what have you, and put it out there. But it's the cost benefit analysis kind of thing, and I'm sure they've got smarter minds than me, figuring all that out money wise. Um, yeah, I don't know. Maybe one day I would like to see it, but I will say this: I hope it's their original material, meaning the current Queensryche.
Me too.
I
Me too.
really,
And if I had to make the choice,
yeah,
I'd rather have a brand new album.
yeah. I mean, their albums. I mean, the current Queensryche's albums. I mean, you can dislike things and have opinions all you want, but I mean, I I think they're quality, and
I've
and I
liked
really
every
I
one of
really
them.
have enjoyed them.
Yeah.
You know, so it's just for me as a fan, my version of the things is I would like to see this version of Queensryche continue playing their albums with that they made with Todd La Torre, because I think those albums really suit his voice, and they're his records with the band, and they did tour on and do a lot of their newer material with La Torre, and I'm not sure if it was less well received than they thought it would be, and that's why they flipped over to doing this Origins tour where they do the EP and the Warning. I don't know. But I, for one, as a fan, was really impressed when they came out and just started playing all the La Torre era stuff, because
Yeah.
that's who they are now. And I, as a fan, I really enjoyed that.
Yeah. I remember hearing those live tracks that were on the bonus edition of the self-titled album. And I think there's a couple of them on the Verdict bonus CD too, like this Queen of the Reich. There's
Yeah,
Enforce, and
Eyes
I'm
of a
thinking, well,
Stranger.
I'd like to hear that whole show.
Yeah, I think
But
it was. I think it was Eyes of a Stranger on maybe Take Hold. Yeah, it would be cool.
yeah, so obviously they recorded those. But anyway, um, we could talk about Queensryche indefinitely. And look, I'm telling you, folks, if you're interested in the history of this band, the touring history, the rise, the slight decline, but the difference in the stage shows, the difference in the stage raps, lots of memorabilia. You want to get this book, Roads to Madness, The Touring History of Queensrÿche, 1981-1997. We have been speaking with the author, Brian Heaton. Brian, thank you very much for talking to me.
Tim, thanks for having me, and I really appreciate it. Good luck on your Kansas book.
Thank you. Yes, one author to another. Keep selling books. That's what we do. All right. So thanks, everybody. And yeah, hope you enjoyed this edition of Tim's Vinyl Confessions. Go get the book and listen to some modern day Queensrÿche. That's my challenge. We'll see y'all later.